When we think of World War II, certain images immediately come to mind. We picture the skies over Britain filled with aircraft locked in a desperate struggle for survival. And at the heart of that struggle was one of the most famous fighter planes ever built, the German Messerschmitt Bf 109. This aircraft was a true icon of the war. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, it was a deadly weapon. It was fast, agile, and climbed into the sky with incredible speed. For the Allied pilots who faced it, the Bf 109 was a fearsome opponent, a symbol of German air power that dominated the early years of the war and remained a threat until the very end. The story of the Bf 109 is a story of incredible success. More of these fighters were produced than any other in history, with over 33,000 built. It was the plane flown by the highest-scoring fighter aces of all time. Men like Erich Hartmann, who claimed an astonishing 352 victories, achieved most of them while flying the Bf 109. From the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s through the Blitzkrieg attacks across Europe to the final desperate battles over Germany in 1945, the Bf 109 was always there. It became a legend, a masterpiece of engineering that defined an entire era of aerial combat. Its sleek, aggressive shape is instantly recognizable to anyone with an interest in military history. But legends often hide a darker, more complex truth. Behind the stories of victories and famous pilots, there is another side to the Bf 109's history. It is a story of a critical design flaw, a hidden weakness that haunted the aircraft throughout its long service. This flaw had nothing to do with its performance in the air. In fact, it was most dangerous when the plane was at its slowest and seemingly safest on the ground. The very design that made it a brilliant fighter in the sky made it a difficult and dangerous machine to take off and land. This hidden problem would cost the Luftwaffe dearly, not just in lost aircraft, but in the lives of its pilots. In this exploration, we will look beyond the myth of the Bf 109. We will uncover the story of this deadly design flaw. We will investigate why it existed, how it affected the pilots who had to master it, and the terrible price Germany paid for it. It is a fascinating and tragic tale of how a single engineering choice could have such a profound impact on the course of the war. It reminds us that even the most celebrated machines of war are built by humans, and they are never perfect. The story of the Bf 109 is not just about its strengths, but also about the profound lessons learned from its greatest weakness. To understand the Bf 109, we must go back to the years after World War I. Germany had been defeated, and the victorious nations, like Britain and France, wanted to ensure it could never start another war. They created a document called the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty placed very strict limits on Germany's military. One of the most important rules was that Germany was forbidden from having an air force. It could not design, build, or operate any military aircraft. For a proud nation with a strong history of aviation, this was a major humiliation and a significant strategic handicap. The sky, a new and vital battlefield, was closed to them. But rules, as we know, are sometimes made to be broken, especially when national pride and ambition are at stake. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Germany began to rebuild its military in secret. This was a very risky game. They had to hide their activities from the inspectors who were sent to check that they were following the treaty. To get around the ban on military aircraft, German companies designed what they called sport planes or mail planes. In reality, these aircraft were often prototypes for future bombers and fighters. The pilots were trained in secret flying clubs, which were really the foundation of a new air force, the Luftwaffe. It was a period of clever deception and quiet defiance. It was in this atmosphere of secrecy that the Bf 109 was born. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power, and the secret rearmament program accelerated dramatically. The new regime announced a competition for a modern, single-seat fighter plane. The man who would create the winning design was Professor Willy Messerschmitt. He was a brilliant but controversial designer. His company, Bayerische Flugzeugwerke, which is what BAF stands for, took on the challenge. Messerschmitt had a clear vision. He wanted to build the smallest and lightest possible airframe around the most powerful engine available. This philosophy focused purely on speed and performance in the air, a goal he would certainly achieve. The result of this secret development was the Bf 109. When it first appeared in 1935, it was a shock to the world. It was a revolutionary aircraft that was years ahead of the biplane still being used by many other countries. It was a clear signal that Germany was not only rebuilding its military, but was also pushing the boundaries of technology. The Treaty of Versailles had failed to stop them. Instead, it seems to have pushed German designers to think in new and innovative ways. The Bf 109 was the ultimate product of this secret ambition, a fighter born from defiance and designed for one purpose: to dominate the skies of Europe. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was not just another plane, it was a technological leap forward. At a time when many air forces were still flying biplanes made of wood and fabric, the Bf 109 was a vision of the future. Its most important feature was its all-metal construction. The entire body, or fuselage, and the wings were made of a lightweight but strong aluminum alloy. This design, known as a monocoque, meant the skin of the aircraft was part of its structure, making it incredibly strong without being too heavy. This allowed it to withstand the high speeds and powerful forces of aerial combat much better than older planes, giving its pilots a crucial advantage. Powering this advanced airframe was an equally impressive engine. The early Bf 109 models were equipped with the Junkers Jumo engine, but the plane truly came into its own with the legendary Daimler-Benz DB 601. This was a liquid-cooled V12 engine that was a marvel of German engineering. Unlike many British engines of the time, which used a carburetor, the DB 601 used a direct fuel injection system. This was a huge advantage. It meant the engine would never stop running due to a lack of fuel, even during sharp turns or dives. A Spitfire pilot, for example, could lose engine power in a steep dive, but a Bf 109 pilot never had to worry about that. Of course, a fighter plane is only as good as its weapons, and here too the Bf 109 was formidable. Its designers pioneered a clever solution for mounting its main cannon. Instead of putting guns only in the wings, they mounted a 20mm cannon in the nose, firing through the center of the propeller hub. This was called a motor cannon. This configuration meant the cannon's shells flew straight towards the target, making aiming much easier and more accurate than with wing-mounted guns, which had to be angled to converge at a certain distance. This central cannon, combined with machine guns above the engine, gave the Bf 109 a concentrated and deadly punch. All these features, the metal frame, the powerful fuel-injected engine, and the clever weapons layout came together to create a truly exceptional fighting machine. It was faster than almost any other fighter in the world when it was introduced. It could climb higher and faster, allowing its pilots to choose when and where to fight. It was a hunter designed to dive on its enemies from above, strike hard, and then use its speed to climb away to safety. For the young pilots of the Luftwaffe, the Bf 109 was an instrument of air supremacy. In the skies over Spain, Poland, and France, it proved to be almost unstoppable. For all its brilliance in the air, the Bf 109 had a fundamental problem that made it a nightmare on the ground. This weakness was its landing gear. The two main wheels that supported the plane were unusually close together. This is known as a narrow-track undercarriage. When you look at the plane from the front, the wheels are positioned near the center, not far out under the wings like on many other aircraft. This design choice was not a mistake. It was a deliberate decision made by Willy Messerschmitt and his team for very specific reasons. But it was a decision that would have terrible consequences for thousands of pilots throughout the war. The main reason for this narrow landing gear was linked to the design of the wing. Messerschmitt wanted the wings to be as simple and as strong as possible. He also wanted them to be easy to remove and replace for maintenance or transport. To achieve this, he attached the landing gear directly to the fuselage, the main body of the aircraft, instead of to the wings. This meant the wings did not need the extra strong internal structure required to support the heavy landing gear and the forces of landing. The wings could be lighter, simpler, and could even be detached without needing special equipment to support the rest of the plane. It was a clever solution for manufacturing and repair. However, this engineering solution created a serious problem with stability. Think about a table. A table with its legs far apart is very stable and hard to tip over. A table with its legs close together in the center is very unstable and can be knocked over easily. The same principle applies to an aircraft's landing gear. The Bf-109's narrow track made it very unstable on the ground, especially on rough or unpaved airfields. It was extremely sensitive to crosswinds and had a dangerous tendency to swing violently to one side during takeoff or landing. This is known as a ground loop, and it could easily cause the plane to tip over, dragging a wingtip on the ground and cartwheeling out of control. This inherent instability was made even worse by other features of the aircraft. The powerful torque from the big Daimler-Benz engine would pull the plane sharply to the left on takeoff, a force the pilot had to fight with the rudder pedals. The pilot's view forward was also quite poor due to the long nose of the plane. Combining a narrow, unstable landing gear with powerful engine torque and limited visibility was a recipe for disaster. While the Bf-109 was a masterpiece of aerodynamics in the air, on the ground it was awkward, unforgiving, and for an inexperienced pilot, an incredibly dangerous machine. For a Bf-109 pilot, the most dangerous parts of any mission were often the first and last 30 seconds. The process of taking off was, well, a difficult and violent struggle between man and machine. As the pilot pushed the throttle forward, the immense power of the engine would try to wrench the aircraft to the left. The pilot had to apply strong and precise pressure on the right rudder pedal to keep the plane straight. If they used too little rudder, the plane would swerve off the runway. If they used too much, it could swing wildly in the other direction. This delicate balance was incredibly difficult to master, especially for new pilots fresh from training. Landing was no easier. In fact, it was often worse. After a long and stressful combat mission, a tired pilot had to bring this unstable aircraft safely back to Earth. As the Bf-109 slowed down, it became less stable. The pilot had to manage the speed perfectly. If they came in too fast, the plane might bounce on its narrow gear, leading to a loss of control. If they came in too slow, a wing could drop suddenly, causing a crash. A crosswind, even a gentle one, could be disastrous. It would push the plane sideways, and the moment the wheels touched the ground, the narrow undercarriage could give way to the sideways force, starting a vicious ground loop. There are countless stories and official reports that describe these accidents. One famous German ace, Gunther Roll, who survived the war with 275 victories, described the Bf-109 as a dream in the air, but a bitch on the ground. He, like many other experienced pilots, learned to master its tricky habits, but for every pilot like Rawl, there were many others who were not so lucky. Imagine a young pilot, perhaps with only a few hours of experience in the powerful fighter, trying to land on a muddy, poorly prepared airfield on the Eastern Front. Tired, nervous, and fighting the controls, a small mistake could have fatal consequences. These accidents were brutal and unforgiving. A ground loop could happen in an instant. One moment, the plane would be rolling down the runway, and the next, a wingtip would dig into the ground. The momentum would then flip the aircraft over, often crushing the cockpit and trapping the pilot. Sometimes the plane would catch fire. Even if the pilot survived, the aircraft was often completely destroyed or would require extensive repairs. These were not combat losses caused by enemy action. These were losses caused by the plane's own design, happening day after day at airfields far from the front lines. It was a constant drain on the Luftwaffe's resources and a constant source of fear for its pilots. The high accident rate of the Bf-109 was not just a feeling or a collection of stories. It is a fact supported by historical records. The numbers paint a grim picture of the true cost of this design flaw. Luftwaffe records show that a shocking number of Bf-109s were lost in accidents rather than in combat. Some estimates suggest that as many as 1/3 of all Bf-109s ever built were destroyed or heavily damaged in landing or takeoff incidents. This is an incredible statistic. It means that for every 2 planes shot down by the enemy, another one was potentially lost, simply because it could not be operated safely on the ground. These were not just operational losses during wartime. The problem started in training. In fact, training units suffered the most. New pilots, transitioning from slower, more stable training aircraft to the powerful and unforgiving Bf-109, found the change incredibly difficult. The Luftwaffe's own statistics from before the war are very revealing. In one period, it was found that approximately 10% of all Bf-109s were being lost to accidents each year. The problem was so severe that it was said the Bf-109 had killed more of its own pilots in training than the enemy had. While this might be an exaggeration, it highlights the very real danger that student pilots faced every time they climbed into the cockpit. This constant loss of aircraft and pilots had a serious impact on the Luftwaffe's strength. Every plane destroyed on a runway was one less plane available for combat. Every pilot killed or injured in a training accident was one less pilot to send to the front. As the war progressed, Germany faced increasing pressure. It was fighting on multiple fronts and was desperately short of experienced pilots and new aircraft. The high accident rate of its most numerous fighter made this situation much worse. Resources that could have been used to build more planes or train more pilots were instead spent replacing avoidable losses. It was a self-inflicted wound that never fully healed. Comparing the Bf-109 to its main rivals makes the problem even clearer. The British Supermarine Spitfire, for example, also had a relatively narrow landing gear and could be tricky to handle on the ground. However, its accident rate was significantly lower than the Bf-109's. The American P-51 Mustang, which came later in the war, had a wide-track landing gear that was attached to the wings, making it much more stable and forgiving. The contrast shows that the Bf-109's problems were exceptional. The design choice made by Messerschmitt to simplify the wing had created a persistent and costly safety issue that plagued the aircraft for its entire service life. The leaders of the Luftwaffe and the engineers at Messerschmitt were well aware of the Bf-109's dangerous landing gear. The problem was obvious from the very beginning, and the high number of accidents was impossible to ignore. Throughout the war, there were numerous discussions and attempts to find a solution. Engineers knew that the fundamental issue was the narrow track of the undercarriage. The most logical solution would have been to redesign the system completely, moving the attachment points for the landing gear outwards onto the wings. This would have created a wider, more stable base similar to the designs used by the Spitfire or the P-51 Mustang. However, such a major change was much easier to imagine than to implement. Redesigning the landing gear would have meant redesigning the entire wing structure. The wing would need to be made much stronger to handle the forces of landing, which would add weight and complexity. More importantly, it would have required stopping the production lines to introduce the new design. During a total war, this was simply not possible. Germany needed every single fighter it could produce immediately. Halting production of the Bf-109 even for a few weeks would have created a critical shortage of aircraft at the front. The demands of war meant that a perfect solution was sacrificed for a continuous supply of a flawed but effective fighter. Instead of a complete redesign, engineers tried to make smaller improvements to mitigate the problem. On later models of the Bf-109, like the G series, they fitted larger wheels and tires to provide better handling on rough ground. They also strengthened the landing gear legs to make them less likely to break under stress. Some models were even fitted with a taller tail wheel to improve the pilot's view forward during taxiing. While these changes offered some small benefits, they never addressed the core issue, the geometry of the landing gear. The plane remained fundamentally unstable on the ground. Ultimately, all attempts to fix the Bf-109's landing gear were unsuccessful because the flaw was too deeply integrated into the aircraft's basic design concept. Willy Messerschmitt's original philosophy of building the smallest airframe around a powerful engine with a simple, detachable wing had locked the design into this dangerous configuration. The very thing that made it easy to manufacture, attaching the gear to the fuselage, was the source of its greatest weakness. The lesson was clear. A decision made early in the design process can have consequences that are almost impossible to undo later on, especially when a nation is at war. The pilots of the Luftwaffe simply had to learn to live with and too often die from this unfixable flaw. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 remains one of the most important aircraft in the history of aviation. It was a brilliant fighter that achieved legendary status, and its performance in the air rightfully earns it a place among the greats. It pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the 1930s and set a new standard for fighter design. The story of its strengths, its speed, climbing ability, and powerful armament is a testament to the skill of its designers. For years, it was the benchmark against which all other fighters were measured. It was in many ways a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering. However, its legacy is also a cautionary tale. The story of the Bf 109 is incomplete without acknowledging its fatal flaw. The narrow, unstable landing gear serves as a powerful reminder that an aircraft must perform well in all phases of flight, including those on the ground. A fighter plane is useless if its pilot cannot take off or land safely. The immense number of accidents and the loss of so many pilots and aircraft show that a design philosophy focused purely on air performance can be dangerously short-sighted. It teaches us that practical considerations like ground handling and pilot safety are just as important as speed and agility. The lessons from the Bf 109's problems were not lost on future generations of aircraft designers. In the years after World War II, engineers placed a much greater emphasis on creating aircraft that were not only high-performing, but also safe and forgiving to operate. Landing gear design evolved significantly. Wide-track undercarriages became the standard for high-performance aircraft. Designers understood that stability on the ground was not a luxury but a necessity, especially as planes became faster, heavier, and more powerful. In a way, every pilot who safely lands a modern jet fighter owes a small debt to the harsh lessons taught by the Bf 109. Today, the Bf 109 is a celebrated icon at air shows and in museums around the world. When we see one, we should remember its dual nature. We should admire it as the revolutionary weapon that dominated the skies of Europe and was flown by some of the most successful pilots in history. But we must also remember it as the flawed machine that brought tragedy to so many of its own crews. The Bf 109's story is a perfect example of the complex relationship between design, technology, and human cost. It is a story of brilliance and blindness, of victory in the air and disaster on the ground, making it one of the most fascinating and instructive chapters in the history of flight.